Chapter 3. The walk itself was not unpleasant. Anne knew it to be beautiful country. Nonetheless, she found the journey nerve-wracking. She could hear the wood and life all around her, but see nothing. The wind in the trees made strange noises, and she found it hard to maintain her bearings. The emotional torment of knowing she would never see these things again did not help at all. She thought, perhaps, that, in a small way, not seeing might be a blessing on the other end. She would not compare every tree and lawn to the ones here and find them lacking. She promised herself she would not pine away for Faerie, as so many like her who had crossed the borders and returned. She clung to her guide's arm, having no choice but to trust his footing with her own. Skye was partly relaxed. He knew it to be mostly peaceful on this end of things. With no border between the red-haired bitch's realm and this one, there was nothing to squabble over except the gate itself, and she had others. There should be no threat, though he still kept his eye out. The grass was soft and vivid green here, and the people they passed few. Here and there he spied them watching, some with interest, some sadness, still others with hope. Even one of the great stags stood at the edge of the path and watched them pass fearlessly. There were guards near the edge of the kingdom, and he could see them ahead. There were elves he did not know, but then those like him, taken from the other world, were never given solitary border duty. The elves nodded to him as they approached. There were methods of communication among them that baffled him, so it did not surprise him that they seemed to know his errand. He paused before them. It was just as well that the girl is blind, he thought, from the looks of pity the elves gave her. If he read her character aright, she would have found it unbearable. "Be well, mistress." "Commander," the left one said. He was as fair and bright as any Tuatha Skye had ever met. "The way is clear." The right one, dark as raven's wings, with pale skin and vivid eyes, pointed down the path. "The way twists and winds a half-league more, then falls straight as an arrow to the gate. If you remember nothing else in the next hour, remember to stay on the path." Skye frowned, confused as to why he would say such a thing. Of course he would remember to stay on the path. Before he could respond, a distant horn rang through the territory. Beside him, the woman tensed, turning her head every which way, trying to locate it. His hand over hers on his arm did not soothe her, especially not when the fair one touched his shoulder and said, "Tread swiftly, and swifter still." The dark one added as a second blast sounded, nearer, coming from outside of the kingdom and headed for the path. Skye glanced down at the grass of the road, watched it turn a darker green verging on black. "'Tis the wild hunt. The bitch couldn't ride her own trod, she has to taint ours," he spat, his dark hair falling in his pale face as he unsheathed his blade. "She's thumbing her nose at the king," the bright one said, and pushed Skye down the path. "Run with your sword in hand and don't stop. We'll try and hold her off or divert her." Skye needed no second urging. As a child he had once heard the wild hunt tearing across the moors one Samhain, the hellish hounds baying as they sought and pursued whatever they came across. The fear of it had chilled him to the core, and he propelled himself and the woman down the darkening trod towards the distant gate. The sound of the horn and the baying hounds frightened the governess more than the beast that had taken her eyes. She supposed it was that now she was the one in danger, not the children, but that was no comfort. She made herself run, fearing to stumble on something she could not see, not that she had the choice. She supposed the commander would have dragged her, or hauled her undignified over his shoulder. That thought alone made her try to keep up with him. She turned all her concentration on him, and focused on the slightest movement of his body to tell her if the next step was deeper than the last, or higher, trying to read the road through him. It helped with the fear, if nothing else, and still she stumbled from time to time. She wondered why he had not drawn his sword as he had been warned. Behind them they could hear the sudden contact of the two elves with the enemy. They ran, the conflict already beyond the bends in the road and unseen but vividly heard. Skye wondered how long she could maintain this pace, tried to keep her as steady as he could while not sacrificing speed. It seemed that they had been running for 20 long minutes, but he knew better, and now he could hear the baying of hounds back along the road. He kept his ear to it, gauging their proximity. He had to get her to the gate, or at least to the straightaway. The hounds were getting closer. Then the two of them rounded the last corner, and he could see the gate looming a few 100 yards distant at the end of a gentle, downward slope. Skye clenched his fist, and the claymore melted into it. It flashed through his mind to wonder if it would still do that, come to his hand when he thought of it, when he stepped into the real world. He took her arm from his, holding her just above the elbow. "Run, straight as the arrow, and don't stop until the world feels less. I'm right behind you." With that, he gave her a little push in the right direction and turned to face the beasts as they skidded around the bend, hot on their heels. She staggered a moment, heard the sudden snarling and slavering in his Scottish battle cry, and ran. She tried her best to keep to a straight line, but couldn't be sure she had. She felt very uncertain suddenly, terrified, but kept running. The sounds behind her were terrible. The ones before her, only the wind in the grass and too soft to be heard over the fight. She kept her hands out in front of her to keep from running into the gate itself, not knowing what it looked like or if it was a literal gate at all. Her hands met foliage, small-bladed leaves, sharp, short, twiggy branches, growing taller even as her hands touched them. Panic beat at her breast as it seemed they were endless, deep, her arms reaching through them and being drawn in. The commander had said nothing about a hedge. From the sound of things, one of the hounds had either slipped past her escort or killed and survived him. Something enormous was pounding the grass behind her, slavering, snarling, baying. She felt like screaming, but nothing would come out. Suddenly, hands closed on her wrists and pulled her through the hedge almost violently. Then warm arms wrapped around her, pulling her in a crouch, and a hand covered her mouth. There was a snuffling on the other side of the bushes, an angry growling, the sound of haphazard digging, then the war cry again, and a yelp followed by the sound of more hounds, more demonic sounding than the last. The hands that held her drew her up, said something to her she did not understand, and drew her away from the wall of green and the spilling of blood. They did not run, they walked, and she knew why. Those were the hounds of the immortal hunt. She had run before because she had already been seen and targeted, but now there was another target for them, and it would not be wise to attract their attention. The unknown person took her through a twisting pathway and more hedges, a maze perhaps, walking for several minutes before the world just felt different. It was warmer, for one, almost unbearably hot. The smell of flowers was everywhere, and there was a different type of noise, many voices doing many things, laughter and music. She could hear a fire somewhere, and a pipe, a harp, and the world just felt less intense, less real. He drew her forward several paces, saying something else in that language she felt she should know, but didn't, and then let go of her. She racked her brain, trying to remember what was off about things, what she was doing standing wherever she was, surrounded by people she didn't know and couldn't understand. Her memory was spilling out of her like a punctured wineskin, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. People came up to her, spoke their gibberish. Someone touched her, and she jerked back with a gasp, and they did not try again. She could tell they were trying to be soothing, but she was momentarily incapable of reason. Something vital was draining from her, and she felt bereft and lost and confused and too many things to put a label to. It was all just too much. "Where am I, and who are you? Why am I here?" she asked in Gaelic. Several of the voices professed confusion, but someone stepped up, said a few scattered words in very poor Irish. "Midsummer's Eve. Celebration. Safety. You stop now. Rest. Go take freshness?" She turned her head to the voice. It was feminine, young, from a tall source. She tipped her head up, trying to decipher what the child had meant. Others spoke around her, some of the voices sounding shocked, one or two knowing, as if whatever they were saying explained everything, and most of them withdrew. She decided whatever was going on, it was safer than what she had fled, and allowed the girl to take her hand and lead her down a path and up a few shallow steps to a quieter area to sit. She perched in the chair, prim and proper, ankles crossed, hands in her lap as she listened intently to what was going on around her. The girl pressed a glass into her hand and Anne sniffed it. It was cold, but smelled vaguely of tea. She sipped at it, found it far too sweet, and held it back out. I thank you, but I'm fine." "You name?" "I, Celaine O'Leary," the girl said. She tried to remember. There had been a name. A long time ago. She hadn't liked it, but it had been hers. Then there was the name the others called her, though what those others were eluded her for the nonce. "They called me Lady of the Mists," she answered softly. The girl's Irish was poor indeed. What she took from the simple sentence was not what had been said. "Anne Kilburn. Nice." She sighed, let her go. Anne was as good a name as any, and hearing it warmed her somehow. She let the girl talk, rattling on in her imperfect Irish, understanding only the gist of her speech. She talked about the Queen of the Green and someone new and a coming fight between the Holly King and the Oak King. Typical midsummer festival activities. She was beginning to tune the girl out when she heard sounds just beyond the wall she sensed behind her. Loud, male voices. One of them spoke the strange words, but with a lilt that was music to her ears, and salted well with words she understood. Embarrassing though one of those words was. "What the bloody hell has that Sassenach done this time? I'll string him up by his McGarley if he interrupts my daughter's crowning." The voice growled in a fair Cork accent. She turned to face the direction the voices came from as the others with him said more unintelligible words. The voices started to fade deeper into the building, and she was suddenly desperate to meet the source of that voice. There was something familiar in its fluid warmth and the easy pronunciation of words her current minder would have stumbled over. Not that she held it against the child. Even in her day, many children grew up ignorant of their native tongue, thanks to the bloody Sassenach, as the man had said. Desperate, she shouted the first thing that came to her mind. "Eringo bra!" The voices stopped. She heard the sound of turning, but not really the sound of feet. A door was passed, and a man stood before her. There was an exchange between him and the girl, and all she understood was, "Anne Keoburn." "On," she corrected firmly in Irish. "'Tis pronounced on." She then turned to the man and held out her hand. "I don't know rightly what my name is. They called me the Lady of the Mists. At least most did, though that is all I can remember at the moment." Her expression went dreamy and wistful at that, though she could not for the life of her understand the reason for the emotion.
"I can see why,"
came the voice, liquid gold. "Anne Keoburn is as good a name as any for now." "She no say who's she out of," the girl injected.
"Like as not she doesn't yet remember. But she need not. I know whence. I can smell him on her."
His hand reached out and took hers. She felt the distinct shape of eagle's talons against her palm, and something clicked between the sound and the smell of him. Something familiar and comforting that she could cling to.
"I am Ian the Griffin O'Keefe, patriarch of the O'Keefe clan in this motleyed mess of refugees. 'Tis glad I am to welcome another Irish expatriate to my home. Welcome to the Griffin's Rest. I've more than a few responsibilities this Midsummer's Eve, but I'll make time enough for you after."
"I thank you. I'd not interrupt for the world. I'll await your pleasure, chieftain. Might I ask where I am afore you be going?"
"Florida, in the Americas, long way from home. 'Tis the 21st century, the first day of May, in the year of our Lord 2010.
He started to walk away, then paused.
"Might I ask, why'd you cry out Ireland forever?"
She smiled shyly, blushed slightly. "Well, you were the first clearly Irish voice I've heard. I speak not a word of the Sassenach tongue, or I don't remember it. And there was a touch of the familiar about you. You were walking away. I knew no true son of Ireland would let that call go unanswered." He laughed, warm and leonine.
"Do you by chance remember a monarch or a battle? Some marker to tell me how long you've been gone?"
She thought a brief moment, knowing his time was precious, and could tell by the anxiously shifting feet behind him that his aid needed him badly. "I believe I'm from County Clare, and I've only seen the monarch on coin, and I've no love for the English. I am sorry." He set a comforting hand on her shoulder.
"No matter, lass. We'll sort you out soon enough. Kaylee, go find young Bethany to escort her around. Her Irish is better and she'll need a fairer translator. Chances are she'll remember more that way." "All right, Reggie, I'll go and deal with that pansy-waisted Cenobite."
As he walked away, Anne turned to Celaine as she rose. "He has an issue with an English monk?" she asked. "Monk?" the girl asked, confused. "The Cenobite. It means a celibate." "Is that what means? Chatham not monk, but live one. Stay, I get Bethany." Anne remained where she was, listening to the sounds around her. There were games being played, wrestling in some places, music in others. There were a lot of people here, so it did not surprise her that it took a while before Celaine returned, breathless, with another girl in tow. The new girl strode right up to Anne without preamble and picked up her hand, pressing it into her own in introduction. "I am Bethany O'Keefe. I'll be your tour guide tonight." Anne breathed a sigh of relief as she clasped the hand. The girl's Irish was good, though a little off somehow. Anne suspected it was more modern, but far more understandable than Calane's. Anne Ceobran. She felt the girl's head tip sideways, having not yet released her hand. Your name is of? Or am I mistranslating something? Behind her, Killeen muttered a farewell and ran off to join some boys, calling her name. Anne blushed a little. All I can remember was being called Lady of the Mist, and it seems inappropriate to call me Lady. Bethany let go of her hand and sank into the chair next to her. We could just call you Mist. Mist in English, by the way. Or Misty? Anne frowned at the English word. I don't like the sound of Misty. Too hissy. Sounds too much like a pet name for a spoiled noble. Bethany laughed, open and free. Aye, that it do. Well, I suppose those who don't speak a proper tongue will simply take it for a twisted pronouncing of Anne. If you're all right with it. Anne nodded. I'll take you around if you like, let you get the feel of things. Things are a little bit bedlam tonight, but it's not always. It's Midsummer's Eve, she smiled. I expect nothing less than shenanigans. You talk like a schoolteacher. Anne could not tell from her voice if that was a compliment or not. I was. Governess, actually. I can't remember, and I want to. Well, there will be plenty of time for that later. Now, I've a blind friend at school, so I've some idea what I'm doing. You shouldn't have too much trouble. Good, Anne injected. You can teach me what I need to know. The girl, on her way to standing, paused. You haven't been blind long? Anne's fingers drifted up to her eyes, touched the empty sockets, and felt the faint, damp swirl of fog within them. This is new. I am so sorry. With the name, I thought that was why. I feel like an ass. Don't, she smiled indulgently. There is no way of knowing, and, she said, standing, I've not been to a proper midsummer in forever. The gentry, I don't think, celebrate quite the same. The smile on the girl's face was easily heard in her voice as she took Anne's hand and hooked it around her own elbow. Then let's get to it, shall we? Now watch the port steps, all right? She found herself brought expertly around the rather large estate, from group to group, and introduced, with everything described to her with care and detail. Some things, Bethany found, had to be explained further than mere appearances, mostly the modern things. At one point, she led on to the carriage house to let her run her hands along the cars before she explained them. They ride awfully low. Where do you hitch the horses? And aren't they heavy for your standard team? Bethany laughed. The horses are under the hood. Anne turned. Magic? But you said these were a mundane thing. 'Tis a machine. You're familiar with machines, aye? She thought a moment, an image pressing into her mind from her only visit to Dublin. They're trains? Like. No tracks, though. A lot cheaper, too. Not a steam engine, though a similar principle. If there are books, I'd like to read about them. Only. Her face fell as she remembered. I think that is the part I'm going to hate most. Bethany brightened as she led Anne out of the carriage house and back toward the festivities. Well, you have two options there. One, I could read to you. I'd hate to impose. I used to read a lot. Beth laughed. Or you could learn Braille. Braille? They have this way of writing the letters in raised bumps. Ingenious, actually. You read with your fingers. I'm sure Uncle Ian can hook you up with a primer or a teacher. She perked up at that. If that will not put him out, I would like that very much. So, he is your father's brother? Bethany laughed. Nah, the relation's a little more distant than that. He's the chief. Everyone calls him Uncle. Beats the hell out of Godfather. She laughed at her own joke, one Anne did not understand but politely said nothing. Only people who don't call him Uncle are his daughter and Nan O'Keefe's. Anne smiled shyly. There are a lot of ye. Just as many not. Though a good chunk of us do live out here at the rest. And he adopts. But he'll explain the reason for that later. She began to draw her off in a different direction. Ooh, the bard's here. You have a bard? Anne gasped, her skin tingling. She had rarely been in the presence of an actual bard. They had been rare in her day. She paused at that thought, but the explanation refused to come. And after was a blank. Bethany drew her to the back of a sizable crowd where she could quietly translate the English words of the storyteller without disturbing the others around them. Anne heard every word Bethany poured in her ear, her agile mind pairing the English words with the Gaelic like puzzle pieces snapping into place. But she was locked on the voice of the bard. It was a beautiful voice telling the story of midsummer, why it was celebrated, and how. Warning of the northern gentry lady, the unseelie queen, who chose this night to ride with her hounds through the mortal realms, and the precautions they took every year, the hedge they made to grow on the far side of the gate to keep her in. As his silk-on-snow voice flowed through a tale of the wild hunt, she found herself trembling, without understanding why. It was a pleasant shock when she realized the voice had fallen silent and the crowd had lessened. Cool fingers drifted across her brow to catch stray locks of her hair that had fallen in front of her face, and tucked them tenderly behind her ear. Now why would such a fresh Irish rose be all a tremble on a night like this? His voice still held that smooth quality, soft but clear, almost scintillating, its coolness welcome in the warm air, the accent so light and lilting. She suppressed a shiver at his touch. No one had touched her like that since her mother, so very long ago. Certainly no man. She was melting, and it just wouldn't do. I am not rightly certain why your tale disturbed me. I remember something, but nothing clear. I've... She struggled with the memory, almost able to see through the veil. His tone changed as he settled himself on something near, a tense understanding, a sad kinship. Been chased. By the hunt itself, unless I miss my guess. Inexplicably, she nodded, not really knowing why she did, but he was right. Something else, she replied, fighting for the memory, her fingers drifting up to her cheek to her foggy sockets. My eyes. Why can't I remember? She exclaimed softly in frustration. It was not like her to forget anything. His hand caressed her cheek as he murmured, and she felt a chill followed by a dangerous heat blaze through her body. She clamped down on her reaction immediately. It is not unusual, not fresh out. Something happens between there and here, especially when we've put up the hedge. It's made to confuse the gentry. Human mind's holding a chance. It takes time, if you're lucky. Or not. She could hear the rueful smile in his voice. Manners, however, are not one of those things. I am Johnny Sorrow. An Ceobran, she responded, felt embarrassed of the name for the first time after 100 introductions. Over there, they called me Lady of the Mist. I don't remember anything else. Ceobranach, he said, the word falling from his lips like a deathbed sigh. She could not suppress the shiver. She did not know how she knew he had lifted his head, looking off and away from where they sat by the smaller fire, but she knew he had. The subtle change in his voice confirmed it as he began to speak while still looking, but turned back to her mid-sentence. As delightful as this conversation might become, I believe they're about to crown the Queen of the Greenwood, and I do not think it's something you should miss. We haven't had a new queen in at least a decade, maybe 2. He rose, stood in front of her a moment before she realized he was holding his hand out to her. As she tentatively reached up for it, she understood how she had known it was there. She found it in the air by the chill. He was a source of delicious cool in the hot night. His fingers were long and smooth, calloused at the tips but not at the palms, and strong. He was a harpist then. Nervous and painfully shy, she allowed the bard to guide her to her feet and across the lawn between the 2 main bonfires where everyone seemed to be gathering. Bethany fell into step behind them, saying little. He made certain they were comfortably seated, out of the way, but with an apparently good view from Bethany's exclamation of delight. He sat the 2 women together and stood behind them. Skye had followed the small, fiery-headed man through the gateway and out of the knoll which rose in the dark behind him. He let his sword go, felt it return to his back, half visible but fully felt. It was still a part of him. It did not interfere with the rucksack on his back. His mind tried to unravel the knots it was trying to bind itself into, to remember what was so important about that pack, or why he was concerned about the sword, all the while taking in the sweeping lawns filled with people around an open area between 2 monstrous bonfires. In the distance was a great house, antebellum style, painted in some color other than white. In the firelight it looked a dark gold, with the windows glittering like living things when the fire caught them right. There was a large covered veranda which at the moment stood empty, as everyone had dropped everything to come watch whatever was about to happen. The crowd had found places to stand surrounding the area in between the fires, leaving an opening at either end. The little man brought Skye near one end where a tall, broad individual stood with his arms crossed, dressed in green. Over his brow was a wreath of oak leaves, and around and through it his mid-brown hair stuck out at odd angles that reminded him of eagle feathers. The nose stretched almost beak-like from between piercing brown eyes. He was laughing as they approached.
About bloody time, Fox,
The man said to Skye's fiery companion.
Was beginning to worry you were going to miss the crowning. Hedge up?
Fox looked somehow even smaller next to the other man, answered excitedly. Yeah, got it up just in time, too. The bitch was already on the hunt. I pulled a frightened little bit out earlier, snatched her out of a hound's jaws. He laughed, his adrenaline still pumping. I dropped her off before going back for this one.
Aye, I met the other one.
Ian frowned.
You left a blind girl with no English standing alone in the middle of a crowd of strangers.
Blind? He exclaimed. It came out almost a fox's yap. Shit, Ian. Didn't know that. But I had to go back for this one, he said, pointing over his shoulder at Skye. Turns out I didn't have to. Well, I had to lead him through the hedge, but would you believe the bastard took on at least 5 of the bitch's hounds and survived? He howled his excitement. You should have seen him, Ian. This great monstrosity of a sword, and yet he ripped one's jaws apart Samson style. He's one of yours anyway. An eyebrow went up. The man called Ian turned to Skye.
Do you remember your name, lad?
The only name they called me by were Skye, sir. The second eyebrow joined the first, and the man laughed.
That's not an Irishman, Fox. That's old Scott.
Hey, you all sound the same to me, he growled, grinning. Ian took a swing at Fox, which missed, but he did not seem to expect to connect.
Now hush up the both of you. My daughter's coming.
Skye stepped back obediently and turned. The music changed, became a more stately promenade as Ian stepped forward to the center of the clearing. Suddenly, he seemed more imposing, more kingly. On his head was a shining crown of oak branches, leaves of verdant green and subtle hints of mistletoe interwoven with sprays of acorns. From the left side came an older woman, her head high and a smile on her face. Her hair was short and graying, though once a dark auburn, and she wore a flower-trimmed gown in gold and red silk with a crown of evergreen on her head. She crossed the open sward and stopped a few feet from where the Oak King stood. The music changed again, became more sprightly and spring-like. From the opposite direction came another woman, a younger one, who fairly danced down the path, her bare feet hardly seeming to touch the ground. Merry green eyes glittered from beneath locks of rich red, which bounced down her shoulders in unruly curls unwilling to be bound. She was breathtaking in that elven way, but voluptuous in ways that Tuatha women never are. Skye could not take his eyes off of her. She almost floated up the path to stand opposite the older woman. They closed the distance to each other and reached out their hands. The older drew the younger closer, kissed both her cheeks, and smiled as he turned to face the Oak King, and knelt. He said words that Skye did not hear, solemn and even, as he took the evergreen crown from the older one's head. Skye's eyes and all his attention were on the new queen, watching her quiver with anticipation as the crown neared her hair, as if she could not wait to flit away and dance into the night. As the crown hovered over her head, it changed. The needles fell out in a shower around her shoulders, and the branches shifted to vine and grew, twisting into a more pointed crown with a higher center peak. The moment it touched her shining brow, it burst into bloom, a riot of colors and petals, with no color coordination at all. They were the wild flowers of a meadow in full summer. The Oak King drew her to her feet, and the old queen rose and backed away, smiling almost with relief. He turned to present the girl to the crowd.
I, Ian Griffin O'Keefe, the Oak King, give you Liberty Maribel O'Keefe, your new Queen of the Green Wood and bride of the coming year.
There were cheers all around, though there were murmurs of dissent growing on the opposite side. There was a thudding of hooves as the far crowd parted, allowing through a tall man who looked every inch the stag god Cernunnos. He was tall and lean, well-muscled, naked to the waist. From there down he had the legs of a stag, a simple white loincloth draping his hips. His hair was long and a little shaggy, a deep brown and crowned by a huge rack of antlers draped in holly.
I've come for my bride, green man.
While Skye had never seen such rites before, It was obvious to him there was going to be a ritual battle. Behind him, the crowds began to twitch in that way they do just before a riot starts. Sky went on edge, hand flexing in readiness to receive his sword, unsure exactly what was about to happen.
You dare to challenge for the Queen of Love and Beauty?
Aye, I plan to make her my Queen of Winter. More than that, I challenge you for sovereignty. I, Henry James O'Keefe, the Holly King, challenge you. The days grow short and cold, and your time on this earth is done. Lay aside your crown or I'll tear it from your head. Beside him, Fox suddenly bumped Sky, shocking him from the battle mode he was slipping into. Hey, you weren't given the option, but choose your side quick or stand out. No weapons, but you can wail on whoever you like on the other side. Watch out for non-comps, though. Sometimes they don't get out of the way quick enough. Sky forced himself to relax his hand and looked around, his blood up for more of a rammy brawl, something he hadn't enjoyed in... he had no idea how many years. The two kings were now facing off against each other, with the new queen being held behind the Oak King. Sky spared a second or two to view the battlefield. Both sides were arraying themselves about 20 feet from where the kings stood, flexing muscles, stretching, rolling up sleeves, and grinning like madmen. The squishies were moving further back from the field, removing themselves from danger. His eye was caught by a specific movement to the left of the oak side, a honey-brown head in a fine white blouse, long-sleeved in this heat, and Kelly-green vest being led with unusual care from the field by a willowy male figure with long white hair past his waist. He had to force himself to look back at the field, not 100% certain why that scene bothered him. When two burly young men stepped out of the crowd on his side and took the young queen to the back of their army, he understood why Fox said what he had. When this crowd had gathered, they had already chosen their sides and stood with them. He was standing on the oak side, and it felt right. He glanced around. There was something about most of the combatants that struck him as odd, like the two kings and Fox beside him with his flaming hair, that marked them touched by Faery. Once he had seen it, he couldn't not see it. But there were men among them who were untouched, dimmer somehow. On either side of him, he watched people shifting forms, taking on more bestial aspects, growing larger or smaller, skins changing. They remained human-ish, but they were obviously not human, and that made the brave humans among them far more obvious. The Holly King suddenly looked more stag-like, the antlers on his head fitting the elongating face and his body bulking out, his hands becoming harder but not quite hooves, fine fur sprouting across his chest and arms. The Oak King had likewise shifted, and Sky understood what it was that felt right here. He had a tail and a massive beak. The hands and arms he held out ready to attack were eagle talons, without question. The Oak King was called the Griffin, because he was one. Beside him, Fox lit up, his body becoming that of an anthropomorphic fox-man made entirely of fire. Sky looked down. I thought you said no weapons. Fox laughed. It's not a weapon. Then the Griffin roared and attacked, and the two armies rushed together, with Sky's army yelling, "Save the Queen!" the enemy bellowing, "Take the Queen!" and his blood singing in his ears. Sky surged forth, making a concerted effort not to allow his sword to fall into his hand. He lowered himself into the charge, his body falling into old patterns he had forgotten it knew. He ducked under the first swing coming for him and shouldered the tree-like man in front of him, chucking him over and behind into the sea of others, where he went down with a crack. He plunged forward swinging, his fists connecting with a satisfying thunk into the cheek of a shark-faced man. The main combatants were avoided as their armies dealt with each other gleefully. The Oak King's forces were determined to maintain hold of the Queen, and the Holly King's army was just as determined to steal her. It was absolute bedlam, and it seemed to go on for ages, but Sky knew better. It was likely no more than 5 minutes or so. He plowed his way through, taking the occasional hits and tossing some of the fighters aside rather than engaging, making them someone else's problem. He had just put down a mortal with a strong left hook when something came out of nowhere and cracked him upside the skull, sending an electric shock through his system. He jumped back, momentarily dazed, and saw a swarthy-skinned girl with dark hair flying with static and eyes that glittered with lightning bolts. She grinned at him, reached to strike again. He grabbed a mortal tough coming at him from the side and threw him at her, tangling them both up and giving the man the shock of his life. He turned to engage what could only be described as a centaur when he noticed he was beginning to tire. This concerned him, angered him a great deal. He charged the horseman, slamming his shoulder into his equine chest and bullying him into a small group of other fighters from both sides. The centaur was out cold, along with about half the people pinned under him, and Sky shook his head, feeling marginally better. He turned to take on what looked like a living scarecrow and felt another wave of weakness wash over him. He pulled back, slipping into a cluster of his own side to regather his wits. He was still injured from the battle with the hounds, but they did not seem to be the source of this leadening feeling in his limbs. He looked around, trying to assess the battle. His side was slowly falling. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw something large wading through the fight, barreling towards the guard around the queen. He did not think. He acted. Shoving down the increasing lack of strength, he charged the being which could only be described as a bridge troll. The creature saw him at the last second, managed to dodge just enough that he only took a glancing blow before swatting aside one of the last two defenders guarding the queen. Sky picked himself up and came around for another attack, and saw the troll had been joined by another treant. Another man, leonine and full of piss and vinegar, came up beside him out of the corner of his eye. Their eyes met, and the exchange was brief. The lion took the broad tree man on the left, and Sky squared off against the troll. He drew himself up to his full height and prepped for a punch. Before he could throw his own, the troll's fist rammed him, thudding into his shoulder as he twisted just in time to avoid the full impact. The blow rattled his teeth, staggering him back a step. Behind the troll, the queen shrieked for some reason he could not see. Enraged, he lowered his head and speared him, barreling headfirst into his breadbasket, winding but not toppling him. A musical, feminine voice full of high annoyance snapped from just out of sight.
"Damn it, Reggie, watch it!"
Unable to move the troll forward and feeling the ham fists descending upon him, Sky wrapped his arms around the thick middle and locked his wrists. Exerting more strength than he knew he possessed, he lifted the surprised troll off his feet and tossed him over his head, rugby style. The creature landed, stunned, and just lay there. Sky came face to face for a brief second with the deep emerald eyes of the queen. A shock of a different type ran through him. She smiled, and he felt a flow of renewed strength. She reached out and touched his arm, a place that was still marked by a bloody bite from the hounds, and something sparked. Felt like vines growing through his body just under his skin. He felt stronger than he had in years, refreshed. He became aware of his surroundings in a rush as the treant staggered back from one of the lion's blows and tripped, began to fall into the queen. Sky's hand shot out, snatched him by the trunk mid-fall and spun, shot-putting the hapless being into the mane of the fracas, taking out a few other combatants unable to dodge the falling tree. Sky turned his back to the queen after making certain of her safety and that nothing could approach from behind her. The lion nodded to him, turned with him to face the fray, and roared, deep and loud, his voice carrying for a great distance. Together they faced all of the Holly King's men trying to capture the queen, and found themselves grossly outnumbered. The wall of defenders in front of them began to fall, even as he felt his limbs turning to lead once more. Fatigue ripping through muscles he had already abused greatly today. This was his third fight in as many hours, but it still could not explain this weakening. Then he saw one of the defenders go down, crushed to unconsciousness by a large man he seemed to remember had been on the Oak King's side in the beginning. The slender, reedy woman fell limp to the ground as her attacker reached for another target. Then she slowly sat up. As she rose, she took renewed strength from the breath she drew in, then turned and lunged at the nearest of the Oak King's forces, a broad, goblin-looking man. She grabbed his arm. He yelled as ice flowed from her hand, encasing his arm to the shoulder. She then backhanded him with her other, an ice-encrusted club. He dropped like a stone, and Sky felt another surge of weakness, creeping up his back like a cold hand. The lion man beside him grinned at his reaction, seemed to be holding himself up by sheer will alone.
"You didn't think we were supposed to win this one, did you?"
Sky shook his head, trying to batter the concept into his mind. "Doesn't mean I'm not gonna try," he called. The lion roared his laughter. Sky could not see the main battle for the crowd, but he could hear it over the slowly quieting field. It sounded fierce. Then there was silence. The crowd parted before Henry as he strode forth to claim his prize, the crowd folding in behind him. Sky watched the holly spread into a crown between his antlers, leaves of verdant green with small clusters of white flowers. Then he was before them, and Sky had no choice, stepping aside and dropping to one knee in exhaustion. "I am the Holly King, and the darkening year is mine," Henry said, pitching his voice for all to hear. The queen curtsied before him with her head only slightly bowed, straightening and meeting his gaze. "As am I, my king." He shifted to full stag form, lowered himself onto both knees before her, and bowed his head. "A kiss, fair queen. Your blessing on your people." She stepped forward and pressed a kiss to his forehead. With that touch, a collective sigh rippled through the gathering in waves of relief. Sky felt the aches and pains earned from his battering in the war melt away like snow before the spring sun, felt the magic extending from her to the king, and from him to his people. Even the wounds he had taken in earlier battles were healed. Henry rose, stepped in close to her as if contemplating snatching her up and riding away with her. She glowered at him. "Don't even think it, cousin. You wanted that bit of the right you shouldn't have worked so hard to get me to replace Gabby." The crowd erupted in laughter and shouts of joy and elation, and the air became filled with the sounds of drinking and music and the squeals of women as they were chased off into the aforementioned woods for a proper hunt. Henry shifted up to a man form, still half naked, still antlered and hooved, and snatched up a swarthy, Romany-looking woman for a deep kiss and a quick feel. Sky stood about, uncertain what he was supposed to do next. He watched the queen greet a few people, accepting a drink with her father. Ian seemed a little smaller than before, though no less imposing. The oak crown was gone now, and he was vigorously scratching at his head where it had rested. The queen laughed, holding his tankard for him, passing it back when he finally stretched, sighing with relief. While she was occupied, the lightning woman slipped up behind her, grinning like a Cheshire, and pounced, placing a sudden and passionate kiss to the queen's neck. She melted for a half-second, caught the look of amusement on her father's face, and then pulled away, embarrassed. "Roulette?" she squealed. "I've duties to attend." Gabby, the old queen, stepped up at that from behind Ian, began pushing Liberty towards Roulette. "Aye, you do. And they're to get fucked and fucked. Now get," she berated, pressing a flask into her hand and then giving her butt a swat. She looked indignant, glanced at her father, who was very pointedly studying his tankard, then at Roulette, who was watching her like a cat watches a mouse, daring her to run. Sky watched the woman with Henry untangle herself from him, sneaking up on the queen. She was identical to the other woman, sans lightning. She reached out, slowly, fingers outstretched for the queen's unprotected waist, and tickled. Liberty jumped with a piercing shrill, whirled, and took off running. Roulette watched her run, waiting long enough to take the unopened bottle of whiskey Ian held out, before chasing off after her in the dark, impossibly fast. Shortly afterwards, from beyond the hill, there came high-pitched sounds that said Liberty had been well and truly caught. Suddenly, Ian was looming in front of him, and Sky startled, looking up. He had found himself trapped watching the women for a moment. He felt a shiver develop and remain undelivered at the thought that the Oak King had just caught him ogling his daughter. He was relieved when the man pressed a pint into his hand.
"Drink up, boy. You're a free man now. And tonight of all nights is a good one to gain it. This is a celebration. Treat it thus."
His tone dropped with the volume as he added, as if he understood.
"No matter how you truly feel it. Don't worry for tomorrow. We'll get that squared away after breakfast. Which is at noon, by the by,"
he called over his shoulder as he walked away. The man laughed heartily and disappeared into the crowd, which was impressive, seeing as he was at least a head taller than everyone else. Sky, unwilling to be rude to his unintended host, drank deep from the wooden mug in his hand, and found it full of rich, bitter Guinness. He drank it dry, went looking for another, the rucksack still on his back, forgotten.